Chapter 1. The Mercenary and the Cleric. After a long night of travel, it took the sun rising to its highest point to wake Garrick Landau from his exhausted slumber. The mercenary wiped his eyes. Then he looked to his right, off into the distance, and saw the main path that led to the crossroads. He rubbed one hand over his shoulder-length, dark brown hair, and the other over his beard, then sat up and glanced to his left. Garrick smiled and stretched. Just as he'd thought, his companion was already up and off hunting, since they'd soon be spending most of the day getting to the Mercenary Guild at the far end of the city. Garrick grabbed his pack and then slung his quiver of arrows and bow over his light brown tunic and chainmail. After putting his boots on, the mercenary patted the sword at his side and stood. He took one more look back at the way he'd come and lamented leaving Shepherd's Bend. However, he knew it was the right thing now to keep on moving. Moving to another job. Moving to another adventure, whatever that might be. In his almost 40 years, Garrick had been all over the world of Denaria. The mercenary had walked and worked almost every part of the human kingdom lands, but he'd also felt the shade of the elven forest and hiked to the dwarven mountains. He had also been on the outskirts of the goblin caverns, and even been close enough to the domain of dragons to see one of the great beasts flying high above him in the twilight sky. Even so, thought Garrick, none of that compared to the crossroads. It was the very center of the world, where all the races of Denaria came to trade, work, worship, and leave their woes behind. But the mercenary also knew all too often it was a place to cheat, steal, kill, and hide away. And though it was technically part of King Gideon Brock's realm, the ruler of the human kingdom lands was mostly hands-off, as long as no true trouble was stirring. So to Garrick, along with the others that lived there or made frequent visits, the crossroads was truly a free city. Finally, with all his weapons and gear equipped, Garrick stepped onto the wide dirt path that he would walk for most of the long day. It wasn't anything new. As a mercenary, he'd been up and down this road more times than he could count, and that could actually be said of all 4 paths leading to the crossroads. So much so that it was getting harder to find a place he had never been to set up camp. Still, the tall tree and bushes encircling it had been a perfect spot for the night. He would no doubt remember it for the next time he had to take this route. After a few minutes, Garrick stopped and placed his right hand over his forehead to block the bright sun's glare. He looked behind him and then ahead of him as he started to walk again. It wasn't unheard of not to see anyone else walking this path, still so far out from the crossroads, but by now the mercenary figured he would have seen a dwarf trader, or an elven bowmaker, or even a cluster of knights on their way back to Oberlon, the kingdom seat of good King Brock. And to his dismay, Garrick thought he would have seen his companion by now. As he walked, Garrick saw the road curving around the hillside and hoped he wouldn't be alone much longer. He didn't want to be left dwelling on his thoughts right now. Though his companion wasn't the biggest talker, he didn't have to be. Just having him around was good enough. Then, upon reaching the turn in the road, the mercenary could hear voices and a commotion off in the near distance. Seeing a small rock formation close ahead, Garrick jogged over to it and looked out. Just off the road, near the trees, was an old man wearing white robes and swinging a staff wildly at 3 sloppily clothed men. Garrick let out a sigh. To get a better view, the mercenary slipped out from the rocks and over to a string of bushes closer to the action. He crouched down and peered out. "Well, you were right," whispered Garrick to himself. The mercenary watched as a cleric of Elion did his best to defend himself against 3 bandits. A staff against a knife, a dagger, and a sword were not great odds to begin with, but add in the fact that the bandits were young and the cleric was at least 3 times their age, Garrick knew he had to step in. As he moved stealthily from the bushes to the tree that the cleric was backing towards, Garrick pulled his bow from his shoulder with one hand and an arrow with the other. Then he watched as the bandit closest to the cleric ducked the old man's staff and stabbed him with his knife. Bow raised and arrow knocked, Garrick stepped into view. "That's enough," he yelled. The 3 bandits turned from the cleric, alarmed, but finding 3-to-1 odds, they became confident again. Perhaps a little too confident. The first bandit, a wisp of a man, looked Garrick up and down and said, "Look, mercenary, just keep moving and we'll let you live." This doesn't concern you." It was spoken with a sneer, and Garrick knew he was more talk than action. With his overconfidence getting the better of him, the sneering bandit took a step toward the mercenary. He was most likely the leader of the ragtag group. Garrick let the arrow loose, and it hit the lead bandit in the chest. As he started to fall, the second bandit lunged at Garrick. It was a quick scuffle. After dropping his bow, Garrick threw a left inside elbow to the bandit's temple, stunning him, then unsheathed his sword with his right hand and raised it up swiftly, crashing the bottom of its hilt into the bandit's chin, who then fell unconscious. Feeling the final bandit move towards him, Garrick turned and parried the sword coming down at him. This bandit was bigger, half troll if that were possible, and it was all he could do to keep his sword in place. Knowing his limits, Garrick released and stepped to the side, letting the big man fall forward. There was a rustle in the nearby trees, and though he knew he would take out these bandits, another one or two might mean trouble. The big bandit recovered and swung again, only this time he looked calmer, more composed. Garrick parried each thrust and looked for his opening. Then a familiar feeling came over him, and he smiled. "Sarcastic smiles won't stop me from doing to you what you did to my friends," spoke the big bandit through clenched teeth. "Feeling tired yet?" Garrick took a step back, closer to the trees, still holding the big man at bay. Then he dropped to a knee and held his sword with both hands to steady it against the stronger man's attack. Suddenly the trees rustled again, and in a flash something black jumped out and took Garrick's adversary down with a growl. The big bandit screamed as a black wolf had him by his sword arm. Instantly the bandit released his blade. Garrick stood up and kicked the sword away, then looked at the other two bandits. They were still down, not a threat. "Onyx, release him," Garrick said quickly and sternly. The mystic wolf growled and held the bite for a few seconds more, then obeyed. The big bandit grabbed his sword arm and rolled in pain. "Onyx, watch them," is all Garrick said, and the big wolf sat down happily as if resting after a time of rigorous play. He licked his lips, then sniffed the air.